When virtue declines and vice predominates, little Leo incarnates at Ananda Farm. Our firstborn little child is Leo. Seems so incongruous to have a name like Leo, which is big and like the sun in this little tiny form, but we'll have to see how that unfolds. Anyway, wasn't that on Tuesday, the day of the inauguration? Yeah.
No, the inauguration was Wednesday.
Was Wednesday. Ah, okay. Very good. Good for him. Anyway, so it's been a week of a little bit of hope and relief. We'll come back to that. Yesterday, we had our annual Worldwide Ministers retreat, satsang, with our spiritual directors, Jyotish and Devi. And given the relief and release attendant to the week's events, it seems finally at long last time for a good joke. And having been told by our own dearest spiritual director, I am fully authorized to share this humor with you. And so there it was one day in a hotel of many stories height when a couple came in to register and had with them clearly the wife's mother-in-law, as we say. And they weren't looking all that happy. But anyway, they registered and went upstairs to the 6th floor to their room. Late that night, the desk manager, who was the only one on duty at the time, gets a frantic call from that room saying, "Help, help, you must help me. My mother-in-law is threatening to jump out of the window." And the desk manager says, "Listen, call the police. I mean, I'm just an employee here. We don't do domestic, resolutions and so forth. No, you must come up. Help, help." No, and then he repeated his excuse, call 911 or something. And no, you don't understand. It's a maintenance problem. What do you mean a maintenance problem? Yeah, I can't get the window open.
It's a guy joke.
Mother-in-law jokes will persist down through even into the high ages. I'm sure of it. Especially in India, I suspect. But anyway, there has been a bit of a sense of relief and so on. It was refreshing, regardless of one's political views, to hear affirmed at last on the national stage the precepts on which this country was founded. And even though the course of history and the course of individuals and our lives is dictated far more by events of the past, our karma, and forces greater than ourselves, than our simple conscious minds, it really doesn't matter, because the great light which is within all creation, which is all creation, when we attune ourselves like a violin string to the large universe, if you will, of truth, then from that comes far more satisfaction, fulfillment, harmony, and so on. And yet the course of events in the world are just going to be what they are. Leaders such as the current president, or in any case, are really in many ways but puppets of the great forces of history and karma that sort of course through the world. So it's less important, at least to me, to be any kind of a political statement as such, as it is to understand that our intentions, the purpose for which we act, are far more important than the consequences of our action. You can cause an accident, you can run over somebody and kill them, but your punishment, though it doesn't help that person, is far different than if you intended it. In fact, there's a story, good dear friend of ours, a young man who unfortunately was under the influence, actually did kill another man, a young man, not but a few years ago, and he's in prison now as a consequence of that. This young man is a very kind and sensitive soul, and isn't the sort of person you'd expect or even want to have to be in a prison. And yet it has changed his life, because as a kind of a pre-adult, when all that happened, he was sort of like so many young people, especially it seems to me at least, the young men, a little bit spacey, maybe smoking a little bit of too much of this stuff and doing video games or whatever these guys do. And this was a wake-up call for him, because knowing his parentage, and I think part of his karma is that this is a soul who has, if not great things to do, and in certain respects, certainly good things to do. And so although he's had to go through what he's gone through, I think he owes it his life to the person he killed, though accidentally, to make something of his life. And I believe he will. And so we can't help, in other words, the consequences of what we do. Everything is a mixture. If they pass as this new regime, or whatever you call it, administration, I think is the term we use here, in this new administration may pass all sorts of laws and so forth. You know, you can give everybody lots of money and so forth, but maybe that's good, maybe it's not. It just depends. You know, we're broke to begin with, so never mind that we're broke. Some people may spend it wisely, some may not. And so you have to start with the intention, with the attunement that we have to the inner light of truth. And thus it is that I know I'm not alone, felt a great deal of inspiration watching the events and listening to the inaugural speech that the current president gave the other day, because it renews hope in even just the affirmation on such a grand scale of truth has power, gives hope. The theme for Ananda Worldwide, which was more or less announced yesterday at our minister's satsang, is hope for a better world. Now, when I think of hope for a better world, yes, of course, like the rest of you, I hope we'll solve all sorts of issues like climate change and so on, and I'm sure we will. But for me, the hope for a better world relates more to this divine light. It's the hope and the expectation, including based on the teachings of this lineage, unlike what many fundamentalists feel, which is the world is going to hell in a handbasket. I don't know how you get to hell in a handbasket, but apparently that's the expression we use. In any case, I suspect there's other ways to get there, but most of the planet believes that, you know, that's where we're going. In fact, in India to this day, and they have knowledge of such things that goes back thousands of years, most of them still believe that the world is a long decline trajectory of several 100,000 years towards the nadir of consciousness. Well, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's guru, made an incredible and revolutionary course correction to the astronomical calendar that has guided the culture of India for thousands of years. Most of us in the West, who know nothing about such things, complete ignoramuses as it were, who think that we're the only thing in history and the best thing history has ever offered, have no idea of that. I mean, to us, technology is going to save us. It's going to give us everything we need. It's going to cure cancer, and that can be true also. But the hope for a better world then that we represent here at Ananda is the understanding that the world is in an ascendant pattern. And yet to get to that point, there will be many challenges we have to go through. Jacob McLeod, last Wednesday did what we call the Swami Book Club. He chose the book The Road Ahead, which Swami originally wrote back in, what, 68, 9?
70s.
70s. And it was fun to listen to him present the book, which has been edited and updated and so forth over the years. But nonetheless, based on Yogananda's predictions before his death in 1952, Swamiji, throughout his life until his very passing in 2013, would repeat some of those challenging predictions. And yet, within the context of what he wrote in the original edition of the book, none of those things happened. And so, we don't really know. We don't need, in fact, Yogananda's word for anything at this point. We can pretty much see that the planet, humanity, has quite a few challenges and changes to go through at this point, whatever form they might take. The warning itself, however, is useful, has been useful. It's been useful in the culture of Ananda, to prepare ourselves, to focus ourselves on things like growing food, as Yogananda urged people, buy land in the country with friends, pool your resources, live simply, live what we would call nowadays sustainably. He said, you don't know what's coming. And in fact, I think we can see what's coming. A dramatic change in lifestyles in the next, whenever it is, doesn't really matter. But those of us whose consciousness can adapt by opening our hearts to the realities of others are going to flow with the changes. I didn't get a chance to listen to an interview that was posted between a leader of a group of Proud Boys and a leader of a local Black Lives Matter, but I'm interested to see what that conversation would be. But it doesn't much matter because, you know, okay, we say often pleasure and pain, success and failure, these opposites. And we often thereby say light and dark, but in fact that's not correct. Darkness is not the opposite of light, it's the absence of light. Light is eternal and changeless. There is no opposite to it. The only thing that's missing, and the darkness comprehended it not. Sin, if you will, is ignorance, Yogananda said. And that inability to see the realities of another person, another race, another group of people, is when that light is hidden by the darkness of our self-containment, if you will. And it takes only, because that light of understanding, that light of inclusion is always there. You know, I've said this joke so many times that it doesn't matter if I say it again, but when I moved up here from good old sunny California, where honestly, I hated the sun. I'm not much of a fan of the sun for reasons you don't need to know. But, you know, I grew up as a child praying for rain every day because we were always in a drought. Hey, come up here. Well, guess what? And so I said, where's the sun? And somebody at Boeing said, hey, bud, it's right up there, 30,000 feet. It's always there, bright and sunny and so forth. And so is the light of God. It's always right there. We need only to open to its presence. I grew up, as probably you don't know, as a Catholic boy, right? You don't. I've never mentioned that, have I? Okay. Well, I was, of course, naturally an altar boy. And I did all the usual things, but we're not going to go there right now. But as an altar boy, I don't remember my age, maybe 8 or 9 or 10 or something like that. I'd ride my bicycle to a nearby convent of nuns. It was a cloistered convent, meaning they never went out and anything. And so the local priest, Father O'Sullivan, you know, from Ireland, right? Me and Father O'Sullivan would go to the monastery there, and I went once a week. The different altar boys took turns. And so we'd go there and say morning mass around 6 in the morning, quite early, I think it was, at least for me. And I just remember an experience that was really transformative for me. I was sitting and kneeling there, you know, if you know anything about altar boys, you got to do different things and ring bells and stuff like that. But anyway, so I was kneeling there and the priest was doing the Mass and it was fine. And then the sun came up and right above the altar was this magnificent stained glass. And the sun just sort of poured through that glass. And, just as a young person, a boy, I was just transported. I was just uplifted into this light. And finally, at some point, I heard the priest turn around. I was supposed to ring a bell or something. Anyway, the experience stuck with me, but, I didn't have the vocabulary to understand it. And in fact, later, even when I later studied for the priesthood, such experiences are considered, I suppose still, to be consolations based on grace. In other words, you should never seek such things, and there's a purpose for that, lest we boast, as St. Paul put it. Because what I have learned in meditation and teaching meditation and having the opportunity to talk to many, many people, even all over the world, about meditation, is as soon as we have some kind of inner experience, the ego claims credit. Look how spiritual I am. My chakras are doing stuff. Or, I saw the spiritual eye. Aren't I something? And so the ego, the usurper, immediately jumps into the fray. So the advice not to, seek such things. In fact, the entire history of yoga in India is rife with stories of how seekers in yoga, achieving certain powers, would misuse them, would take it to ego, in other words. We don't have that particular tradition in the West in Christianity. The mystics had all experiences like levitation, etc., but there was no continuous tradition, and they were not supposed to seek these things. Had I realized, it's like the Astoria where Yogananda met, I think he was a monk, a Catholic monk probably, but anyway, he met somebody, and maybe it was St. Louis and Abbot, I get my stories mixed up, but anyway, he met this man who somehow, I don't know how they met, but the man said, I've been praying for many years and I want to know God. And so Yogananda talked to him and said, well, if you practiced an advanced technique like Kriya Yoga, that could really help you to tune in and feel the divine presence. Oh, no, I can't do that. I'm a bhakti. I just go by devotion and so forth. Anyway, at some point, Master, through his magnetism and charisma and charm, convinced the fellow to receive initiation in Kriya. And it was like very soon, perhaps even the next day, I don't recall, that he came back and reported that he had a very deep divine experience. Had I known such things, had I been born into such a tradition, I think I could have, let's just say, found myself sooner than I did. And I had to go off to India at some point to resurrect that dream, to resurrect that knowing with which I was born, that the spiritual path would be my life. But one has to go through what one goes through. And yet there it is. It's always there. Recently, I'm in the debt of peony here because after we moved our apartment for the second time last year, I overdid it, and by degrees, not in an instant moment, but over a period of weeks, I think one of my discs sort of wanted to pop out, as they say. It's very, very painful, and I've never been in a hospital. I've never really been sick to even think about, and was not used to that level of pain. And when you're in the midst of it, just going to bed was a nightmare. Just the thought of sleeping was, because during the day when you kept active, you could more or less ignore it. You had other things to do. The moment you laid down to sleep, you had to battle with the demon of pain. I remember meditating face down, meditating face up. I tried everything. But during the midst of that pain, there was no other reality. And when you think of people who have suffered for centuries, generations, with violence, racism, lynching, I mean, the pain of that's the reality. And if you think of people who seem to feel that they've lost their self-respect, their livelihood, that the culture has passed them by with values and attitudes that they find repugnant, that perhaps as children they were taught that these acts and preferences were evil, and so on, that's pain. And when you get self-enclosed in that, that's all you can feel. That's all you can see. Now I was telling Fiona the other day, I had to think back, what was that like? Now it's gone, and it's like I can't remember what that agony of pain was like. And so it is also, with addiction, and I don't just mean substance abuse. There's all sorts of addictions. And when you're caught up in something like that, and you reach the point where it no longer provides anything that you sought when you first started, in fact, it's disgusting, but you're stuck. You can't get out of it. And that can be anger, it can be all sorts of things. Lust, the usual things, of course, but there's lots of them. You don't need to die to go to hell. It exists right here now between your ears, and also then does heaven. And so this teaching of the great light of God, which is always with us eternally, the essence of creation, is maybe not historically in religious or spiritual terms a revolutionary statement, but it certainly is in terms of our culture and so on. The teaching you have to die to go to heaven and be a good bunny and go to Mass on Easter Sunday or whatever the hell they would make us do, it's not about that. It's within us. I mean, that is a revolutionary story. And when in the reading that Sita did, talked about John the Baptist came not as the light, but to witness the light. We are John the Baptist. We have been born to witness the light of truth that is eternally present within us, 30,000 feet perhaps, so to speak, in terms of consciousness. But it's always there. We are John the Baptist. We baptized, John said when Jesus approached him, I baptize with water, but you will baptize with the Holy Spirit. We baptize with water, meaning our spiritual discipline, our efforts to have right attitude is the water of our efforts. But it's the power of grace, the Holy Spirit, that baptizes us into that Spirit. But we have to do the initial cleansing. On Friday, I started, Padma and I have begun reading in our noontime broadcast, Monday through Friday, from this beautiful, wonderful book of the Rubaiyat. I don't have time. I mean, I shouldn't really segue into the book so much, but we started on Friday. But it's just so pertinent. The very first stanza. I've always loved the Rubaiyat. I couldn't begin to tell you why. It has nothing to do with my upbringing. I'm sure the Catholics never read it. But awake, for morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight. And lo, the hunter of the east has caught the Sultan's turret in a noose of light. That stone is the stone of our effort, our self-discipline, the baptism with water. And it starts with that. In other words, when you don't know the light exists, you have to develop along the lines emotionally, psychologically, intelligently, etc., to a certain degree of refinement, where, as Krishna says in the Gita, you feel the joys and sorrows of all beings. And one of the important purposes of prayer and meditation is the fact that as you refine your consciousness and you feel the pain and suffering of other people. The world of Maya can bring you down. And so the play of opposites, this world is going to go on. I do a lot of correspondence, and somebody on Facebook, I don't know how anyway, so I get this message from somebody I don't know with all these questions. And one of the questions had more to do with, well, when's all this going to end? Is it ever going to get better? Yogananda's response to that is it ends in endlessness. Another way of saying, among other things, that no, it's not going to get better. Maya rules the universe. We only achieve the light as a soul, not as a nation. So it doesn't really matter what happens with this president or that president and so forth. I mean, yes, it does matter in some respects, of course. But what I mean is the light that we seek is within us. And regardless of where that light directs us to the degree we attune ourselves to it, the consequences of our action, well-intentioned, in the world of Maya and duality, may have no effect, may have even the opposite effect. We can't help how people view us, how they interpret our words and our actions, well-intentioned or not. You see? We have to learn to live by that inner light. And as Jesus promised persecution, and we saw in the life of our own friend and teacher, Swami Kriyananda, he said, I eat persecution for breakfast. And he wasn't laughing. It's just the way it is. The world will crucify the light. And when I think of Jesus who, the sins of the world, whatever the verb is, I don't remember, that's what we can do. That's what we're here to do. We're here to carry the cross of the burden of Maya by living more and more in the light. And the interesting thing is, just as Jesus transformed the history of the world, and Buddha and Krishna and etc., and even though a lot of people don't particularly care for what that transformation, some of the impacts of that transformation, hundreds, I assume probably thousands, of souls achieved freedom through that light, through that ray of light. And so we somehow have to achieve a sense of centeredness, inwardness, a sense of detachment based on the security, based on the grace and the power of the inner light, which we seek and there are two ways. I was about to say can only be found within. Yogananda said that there's the social way to freedom, and there's the inner path. The inner path is what we represent here. It's not that we don't represent the social path to embracing all humanity. That comes from the other. And that's our teaching, is that based on the inner experience of divinity, we have the power and the truth to help make us free and to be a light unto the world. It's not an easy teaching, either to experience or to accept, because this world will go on in its own pattern, and most of us won't have much seeming effect. But it only takes a few people, as Swamiji often would tell us. And as I was commenting, you look at history, a very small number of people can change the world. In case of history, it's mostly overthrowing governments, but it doesn't take that many people, as we saw very recently. And yet, on a spiritual level, in the light, we don't know what impact we might be having. Swamiji would often say that in 100 or so years, looking back, history will see that the formation of intentional communities, spiritual communities, will be seen someday to be the most important event of our times. I don't know if that's true. What would I know? But it makes sense to me because it represents a change of consciousness, an acceptance of people of all races and backgrounds living together in harmony, cooperation, moderation, simplicity. I mean, imagine. That's the obvious solution for everything. And so in that sense, in that deeper spiritual sense, I think it will be seen to be the most important thing taking place today. Okay.
Okay, you can